2, 1, go.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. When it comes to its impact on the market dynamics, AI fits within a broader story about digital competition. Digitalizations hold great promise in the form of new services and greater efficiencies. In some cases, it might even make it easier for new firms to enter certain markets. However, digitalization may also lead to durable market power and new forms of misconduct. Where AI fits on the spectrum of harm versus benefits remain to be seen. We will focus our discussion here on two main themes. First, the characteristics of AI technologies will lead to concentration and durable market power, meaning that only a privileged few large firms will be able to fully benefit from the advances in AI technology. And second, whether AI will enable anti-competitive conduct, including a future where pricing algorithms choose, for example, not to compete with one another, but rather to share profits through collusion. We are very fortunate to have an excellent panel with us to understand how things may unfold. And please allow me to present our speakers. Professor Giacomo Calzolari, who is a professor of economics at the European University Institute and fellow at the Center of Economic Policy and Research. Dr. Cristina Cafara is an expert in competition economics who has led for several years the antitrust and regulatory team at Charles River Associates in Europe. And Dr. Pierre Régibeau is the chief competition economist at DG Competition in the European Commission. To set the stage for the discussion, we will now turn to a short presentation by Sarah Kaligaris from the OECD Directorate for Science, Technology and Innovation. Sarah, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Let me share my screen. Can you see it correctly? Okay. So thank you very much. Sorry, I will present a few slides to set the scene on this session before the panel discussion. So this session, as I already mentioned, is going to be focused on discussing the link between the diffusion of advanced digital technologies, and in particular AI, and business dynamism and competition. When we look at this link, many questions arise. Among them, we wonder if the diffusion of advanced digital technologies, and in particular AI, provides advantages to the largest firms, and what are the consequent implications for business dynamism and the challenges for competition. We also wonder if the use of AI for price settings makes collusive outcomes more likely, and of course, what is the role of public policy in this context? OECD work touches upon several of these dimensions. In particular, there is some ongoing work on increasing markups and concentration, which provide a cross-country perspective using firm-level and macro-distributed data. There is also ongoing work on merger and acquisition, one work matching novel data to explore M&As and their implications for innovation, and another one identifying new forms of competition arms from digital sector mergers and how competition authorities should assess them. Finally, there is work on AI and anti-competitive conduct, which explore competition risks stemming from AI and highlights the challenges for competition policies. But let me provide some initial evidence on this topic. So what do we see so far in OECD work? The main message of this slide is that in digital intensive sectors, we found so far faster decline in dynamism and increasing markups. In particular, on the left-hand side, we show that entry rates decline faster in digital intensive sectors than in other sectors, while on the right-hand side, we show that markups, which have been widely used as a measure of market power, have increased more in digital intensive sectors. Moreover, the gap between highly digital intensive sectors and low digital intensive sectors has steadily increased over time. In addition, ongoing OECD work is showing faster increase in concentration and in M&As in digital-intensive sectors. The left graph shows that concentration, which has been measured as the share of the sales accounted by the 8 largest groups in each country industry, has been increasing over time, and especially so in digital-intensive sectors, although the difference is less striking in the most recent years. The right graph reports for the very last 5 years up to 2020, the share of total value of M&A deals for deals where the acquirer, in the case of the blue bar, are in high digital-intensive sectors. And what this figure is showing is that the value of M&A deals by acquirer in digital-intensive sector has gone from representing 40 to 80% of total deals, and has increased also during the COVID crisis. So what's the role of public policies in this context? As mentioned, the OECD work has highlighted that first, most OECD economies appear to have become less dynamic over time with increased firm level markups and industry concentration. And second, that digitalization and AI in particular may lead to new competition concerns and challenges for existing competition policy framework. However, at the moment, it's still too early to tell whether this risk will materialize and what is going to be their overall impact on the whole economy. What is certain is that competition policies will play a key role in ensuring that digital technologies, and in particular AI, foster digital transformation, a digital transformation which is also inclusive. So let me close with some open questions. So first of all, will AI adoption have an effect on market power of firms? Second, has AI revealed any gaps in our competition and enforcement framework? Third, what is the right mix of policies to foster innovation while at the same time boost diffusion? And finally, are competition policies equipped to address the potentially significant impact of the digital transformation on competitive dynamics? So with this initial evidence and open question, I leave the floor to Ori to start the panel discussion, and I thank you all very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarah, for this helpful introduction to some of the policy issues that have arisen in the wake of AI, and to the work that we at the OECD have been doing in this area. Starting with the first topic, where do we put AI? Do you, our speakers, think that AI adoption will have an effect on market power of firms, either by enhancing market power of larger firms on the one hand, or by reducing barriers to entry for new firms on the other hand? So to kick off the discussion, Pierre, would you like to go first?
Yeah, I'll go first, and I will limit myself to answering this first of the two questions. So first thing I want to say is that, the kind of studies that the OECD and others have conducted about the increase of concentration and how it differs across sectors is very useful, but I'm not sure it tells us that much about AI itself for two reasons. First, AI is still a fairly recent development, and in terms of actually having effect on the ground, I would surmise that this would not currently already be seen in the recent evolution of market structure in the sector. The second, that might sound a bit strange, is that AI actually is not that specific to the digital sector. AI can very well be used for, inventory management by a firm kind of selling widget and so on. And actually that might in the end means a greater impact of AI on the economy. So by just looking at the recent evolution, that's too early, in the digital sector, which is not necessarily the right sector, I don't think that the current work can give us an idea as to what is happening with AI. So stepping back from that, do I personally believe that this is going to lead to increasing concentration and decreasing concentration? Now, again, I'm not a specialist of AI. I've been recently putting some decent efforts trying to learn about it, if only because it's a fascinating subject. But my impression is that there's no systematic implications. The introduction of AI will lead to greater concentration across the board. Actually, in many activities, I think that AI products, once they're developed, and made available through the market will actually help smaller firms compete and do kind of very complex tasks that would be too onerous for them, and therefore be able to compete with firms that already have the means of conducting this kind of onerous tasks. So I would expect that in many industries, if anything, there would lead to a decrease in concentration. There is, of course, a caveat, and a very serious caveat is that, and that's going to have to do with data. Now, let me explain that. In order to explain that, one needs a little bit of an idea of how AI is developed. So there are many different types of AI, different type of AI tools, many different ways of developing them, from having ex-ante rules and ex-ante parameterization set by expert, to having what is called deep neural learning, where essentially you start somewhere and through trial and error you kind of invert the result and try to update weights, put on things kind of very slowly until you converge to something, and there's some mixture of this as kind of reward granting type of algorithm, right? And what's important is that for some of those methods, especially the last two, access to significant data to both design the algorithm so it performs well, and then to test it out of sample is something which is important. So take the example of face recognition. Most of the face recognition algorithms have been based on this kind of deep neural network type of approach. So what do you do? Well, you get you get some kind of inputs from the pictures, and this input might be what you see in different pixels or dots or whatever. So some kind of inputs. Then based on that, the decision is made, and then it's compared to how often is it, and then often you're right, and based on whether it's right or not, you slightly adjust the weight, and then you try again. Right? This is a very, very slow process. You need lots of pictures to do that, and not any pictures, but pictures that actually reflect the kind of situations in which this specific AI tool will have to exercise face recognition. Face recognition for you, sitting on your desk is not necessarily the same as face recognition of somebody walking or running through a crowd, for example. Right? So you might need a lot of data at that point. After that, once it is designed and ready to use, there again, I think you can distinguish between two situations. One way you kind of use it, right? And if there's going to be an update that's going to come from the supplier of the AI who will have kept testing it, in that sense, that does not really create necessarily more barriers to entry. But there are also some specific context where by using the AI, you also get further feedback that enables you to further improve the AI tool. And as you can already guess, in those kind of situation, this virtuous circle then might actually lead to the reinforcement of dominant positions. So what does it mean here? It means that if we're worried about dominant position and reinforcement of dominant position, we have to look at the scarcity of the kind of data you need in order to both design and test the AI. And in sectors where those data is relatively scarce, we certainly have to look very, very carefully at acquisition of data by firms that already have a fairly large number of data. And if the situation is extreme, we might even consider some kind of, either essential facility doctrines through antitrust or regulatory access to this kind of training and testing data. Now, what about this kind of feedback effects that can compound things? I mean, the best known example is search, right? So what is special about search, right? You've used kind of tests and so on to develop your algorithm, but each time you use it, you actually have signals, i.e. how often people click, how often they buy, that gives you further feedback as to whether the algorithm is doing well. And if this feedback is proprietary, then essentially kind of snowballs and gives you an advantage, right? So it's especially in this kind of special context that we might think maybe of granting some access to data so as to avoid utter dominance of the field. Now, for the rest, essentially, So I'm going to leave it for now. So I'm just going to stick to the market structure issue, and I'll come back to potential abuses and what it implies for competition policy a little later on.
Thank you, Pierre. Christina, would you like to take the floor?
I will indeed. Thank you, Ori, and thank you everyone for this invitation. Let me start by making the obligatory disclosure for someone who speaks from the private sector. It isn't directly relevant to this particular session, but just as a matter of course, I have done a lot of work in digital adverts to Google and Facebook. I've done work for Amazon, Apple, Microsoft, Uber, and others. So I agree with much of what Pierre has just said. His comments initially about the interpretation of the research that was presented at the beginning is something I find myself very much in agreement with. Whatever is going on in margins concentration there is not necessarily something we can tie back just to AI, precisely because it is incipient and it wouldn't have affected the market structure quite that much, in addition to which there's a lot going on. But let's take back on the question of whether the impact of AI will be to enhance the market power of dominant firms or to somehow lower barriers to entry. I echo much again of what Pierre says. We need to think about, take a step back for a second and think about this particular technology. In a way, it is just a kind of software, but unlike any other software, classic software, which is coded with an explicit instruction written by the programmer, here we have something which is teachable, and it uses data that it reads in, it learns from that data, and then applies what's being learned to make informed decision on new samples of data that it hasn't seen before. By the way, this is very different from reasoning in a human sense, but it is still a form of intelligence. Now, as Pierre says, once the model is trained and validated, then its application can be relatively cheap. But the training and validation of that model is a huge undertaking to begin with. And the state of the art is no longer even mathematical model. We are talking about biologically inspired models, as Pierre says, deep neural network, which are essentially imitating biological model sort of nodes that fired up when they're triggered. And what it takes to train that type of model is absolutely tons of data, okay, and hundreds of hours on supercomputer consuming enormous amounts of energy. And fundamentally, the reason why, notwithstanding the fact that deep learning is not a novel technique, the reason it has taken off now is because now we have these data lakes that can be used to train, and we have these processors, these GPUs that are capable of processing this data as accelerator. There's also quite a lot of heterogeneity across AI, because I mean, I'm familiar with horizontal models of AI, but also vertical models, and they're profoundly different in the way they work. Horizontal is a model that essentially is designed to work across a range of industries, is a building block to developers to do other things. There are also vertical models of AI, which is very specialized, very much specific to a particular environment, trained on very specific environment and data. And the two, and this latter one takes even longer to make precise. So if you think about health transcription, for example, you know, a player like Microsoft has a generic transcription service, but there are very few that actually specialize in really transcribing medical language and medical diagnosis, because the terminology is so specific. So all of this kind of points to certainly quite a special set of circumstances. And I think it's fair to say that the general sentiment around AI is one of some concern about potential adverse effect of this technology. Before I move on to specifically the question of market power, I just also wanted to tee up briefly the fact that not just ethicists are worried about it, but you know, distinguished economists like Daron Acemoglu have written very extensively about the potential adverse effects, not just in the area of collection and control of information, but more broadly in the area of the labor market effects, and of course, exacerbating political, social problems around communication and democracy. So there's quite a lot. We are zooming in on the market power question. And I think based on the brief kind of features that I described before, I think I find it hard at this point to resist the position that AI at this point tends to confer significant advantages to already dominant companies. Why? Because effectively, as I said, the advances that we're making in AI are possible today because deep learning is not new, but you need to power it up with powerful machines, processing units, and indeed data. And these assets are in the main, the assets that are controlled by the usual suspects. Okay, so when you look around, who is actually got the data lakes, the incredible cloud power, the machine power to do this? It is the usual suspects. Now, therefore, it is hard to resist for me the position that this doesn't confer a material advantage at this point in generating these models and validating them. Of course, there are things that kind of push in an opposite direction. Development is going in that direction too. So first of all, yes, it is true that even these kind of great giants may not be able to do everything. I gave the example of a horizontal versus vertical engine in speech transcription and speech interpretation, and that is very much something where even someone as powerful as Microsoft may not have the same ability without a lot of time to develop a very specific vertical in health and medical terms. And this is indeed the case of Microsoft Nuance that was just examined by the European Commission. There are differences there. But moreover, there are also evolutions of the technology that maybe can make this kind of current gap less important. One, well, okay, data can be bought, but two, there are evolutions in the technology itself that suggest that maybe it will be possible to train these algorithms on smaller data set. Okay, so you may not need the data lakes, but maybe it will be small data, not big data. There's a development towards unsupervised models that again are considered to be more or less needy, if you like, in terms of ability to. And then there are also developments in hardware, in chip technology that essentially may reduce the need for enormous power and hours of machine. So some of this in time may reduce the difficulty of or the big gap between the big guys and the smaller guys in terms of the use of this technology. One last point that I will make is that, of course, it is important to mention there is regulation coming in that is specifically relevant to this. For example, yesterday the Commission issued another draft of the Data Act. And there are a few things there that go in the right direction, such as empowering SMEs to get access to data from connected products, Internet of Things, telling the giants, no, not for you, but SME can get access to this data. There's also provisions to facilitate switching between cloud services so that people aren't kind of essentially locked into a particular cloud service. So that kind of regulation can also empower somewhat smaller firms. But to conclude, for me, it's hard to resist at this point in time the proposition that the large giants have got a material advantage in these technologies and they are using them to their benefit. Whether this will somehow diminish in future, I'm not sure. There are some helpful signs, but I'm not sure. But we can discuss about the problems with market power in the second part.
Thank you very much, Cristina. So Giacomo, if I can summarize what the two other speakers have said so far, is basically that AI perhaps is not that big of a drama for competition. It can be good, it can be good. Maybe it's too early to say. Hopefully, I see Christina's face. I'm not.
No,
sure.
I didn't say that at all. but
Sorry.
let's talk about it later.
Okay, Giacomo, please.
Great, we're going to take some action. So thanks a lot for the invitation. And disclaimer, I've not been working for large companies. I'm just a university professor. I, time to time, discuss with authorities, competition authorities on a matter of competition policy and economics. So that's a fascinating topic. So the impact of AI on market power and if anything on concentration. I would like to step back 1 second and tell you what is my take as an economist of what AI is. Because from there, I think we can try to dig a little bit more on what would be the consequences. My view is that AI is a set of tools, a variety of tools, quite differentiated, that is used to make predictions. And predictions are extremely useful in market action, in whatever dimension of markets you may conceive. Having the ability of make good prediction is one of the key elements that generate advantage for companies. Now, the important element, the other important element of AI is that it's a set of very large set of different tools that are applied to many different environments. And there is absolutely not one fit all in this case. You can take the most advanced deep learning tool and apply it to the wrong problem, and you get a disaster. So the idea is flexibility, and if you apply the right tool to the right problem, you get this improvement in terms of ability to predict. Now, this type of flexibility makes AI very similar to other general purpose technologies that we have experienced in the past. One example is electricity. Now, would you think that electricity could have been a cause of increasing market power per se? I don't think so. Now, what is the problem with AI? And as Christina and Pierre correctly mentioned, and I completely agree there, is not AI, is data, is the current situation of data. But let me say now a little bit more on this, data and AI. In fact, as has been said, AI needs data to be trained and to be tested. And once it's only at that point that it can use AI to make better predictions. Now, what is specific with data and AI? Clearly, if the current status is that most of the relevant data are amassed somewhere and under the exclusive hands of a few companies, then we have a big problem, certainly. Now, the question is this actually the big picture we should keep out of that, out of the impact of AI on market? I don't think so. The first element is precisely because I was saying before, there are many different types of AI, many different types of applications. These different models, these different statistical models are more or less rely on the amount of data they use. And so the impact really depends on the application. So in the case of search engines, we may really have a feedback effect where better predictions make better prediction over time, and then they create an entrancement effect. But this is not a general outcome. Let me give you a couple of examples. Some of the AI data are generated by with market interactions. For example, search activity on platforms, on search engines. But some other data are self-generated by AI itself. I'll give you an example. So think about the car market. Probably now when we think about the car market, we think a market that has been stable for decades. Now there are new companies that are entering in the market with the new type of cars. Think about the autopilot. Now the AI system for autopiloting is mostly trained on synthetic environments. So the data are completely generated by the system itself. So it's by means of the simulation in synthetic environments that these systems of autopilot get trained. So that's one example where I think it's important to make differences with respect to where these data are. Let me give you another example. You may be aware of this, let's say, marvel, which is called GPT-3. It's a natural language processing tool, probably the most advanced that we have seen so far, that is able to translate across languages. It's able to translate into codes, algorithms. So you give the instruction and it gives you the code to run the instruction in an algorithm. So GPT-3 has been trained on publicly available text, mostly on Wikipedia, on this type of data that everybody has access to. So summarizing, AI is very flexible and there is no one fit for all. Certainly, for the cases in which AI is using the type of data that is currently amassed in the hands of few, that's a problem, but it's a problem for the data, of the data, not of AI. And at some point, Christina mentioned what I think it's a very interesting environment that we discussed, I think, too little. We have discussed too little so far in general. And it's the following. So there has been a lot of talking about personal data. No? So personal data come with a host of problems in terms of privacy, starting with, and so on and so forth. There is a little discussion on machine-generated data, which is the new frontier, by the way, of artificial intelligence. So Christina was mentioning SMEs, small companies, their machines, and with the combination of the technologies that we have currently available, which is the possibility to transmit information easily from motors, from machines in an SME, we can train algorithms in order to make production more effective. So there is in a sense, brave new world for machine-generated data that is going to be very useful for AI applied in production. And in this brave new world, we are currently at a situation where we are like thinking about personal data before the directive, the European directive. Now, since there is a sense that we've been too slow to act on personal data, it may be interesting to think to act swiftly instead for machine-generated data. Yes, for the moment, I'll stop here.
Thank you very much, Giacomo. Christina, I probably must have misunderstood what you previously said. It's like, before giving you the floor again, just a follow-up question. You, if I understand correctly, portrayed a mixed forecast to the future. And it can go in more than one possible way. What would you think be the position of policymakers to make AI go in a more pro-competitive direction rather than strengthen market power?
Yeah, the reason I didn't agree with your characterization that I had been sort of painting a picture that things can go this way or that way is that I take a position which is probably more pessimistic than Pierre and Giacomo, that is at this point, AI is being effectively relied upon and used by large actors with large existing advantages. Because, you know, I don't find Giacomo's analogy to electricity very apt. We're not talking about the same. We're talking about a world in which there are 4 or 5 large digital companies with massive machine learning, massive deep learning, massive data lakes, massive computing power, massive cloud capabilities, and they are the best placed to do much of this. Then the question is, will changes occur that will democratize in some way this a bit more? Or will we see the advantage that they have accumulated and continue to have persist? That is the question to me. I mean, there are features that I see that perhaps are suggestive that it doesn't need to be as bleak as this forever. And there are things that Giacomo said and Pierre said that I very much agree with. So I tend to be perhaps on the more negative sort of side of things at this point in time, because I think that these advantages are very difficult to erode. I'm hopeful, but not optimistic. So your question is, what should the regulator do? Well, that's a very big question. I mean, of course, we are operating in a sector, in a field which is antitrust enforcement, regulation, and there are hosts of things that one can possibly do more broadly. But in the area of regulation and competition, there is significant work to be done to assess, evaluate, and deal with these kind of issues. We can move on to the second part, if you like, of your question, which is what are this session, which is what are the kind of conducts that we are concerned about, and what can regulators do? I think that on the side of competition and regulation, there are things one can do. They're by no means the only ones. There is broader kind of innovation policy, technology policy that need to be playing. Not everything needs to be antitrust and regulation. But we can talk about what the antitrust and regulation picture looks like.
Thank you. Unfortunately, a very interesting discussion, but we have to move on to the second question. So it's now a question on competition policy. Has AI revealed any gaps in our competition enforcement framework? 2 possible examples could be the risk of markets otherwise being competitive to lean toward tacit collusion. And the second is the influence of algorithm-based recommendations on competition. This time, Giacomo, I'll let you start.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Excellent, very good. So thanks. I think these are 2 very interesting points that we really have to discuss. So as for the first, I've been working quite extensively on the possibility that algorithms that are used to set prices on markets may autonomously, independently learn to actually collude, and collude in a very deep sense, in a sense that we thought would have been something specific to humans only, and instead it has been we have with some colleagues we have worked quite extensively showing that in virtual markets, and I want to emphasize this, in virtual markets, these algorithms, by interacting with themselves. By the way, this is an example of what I was mentioning before. You don't need data for that. These are 2 AI algorithms or several AI algorithms that are operating in the virtual markets, and they autonomously learn from scratch, and you don't need to give them any data. It's the data they themselves generate that is enough for them to train. So what we have seen is that after some time, after some interaction, they are able to learn this type of collusive behavior that I said is sophisticated because it contains, not only high prices, which is just a surface of collusion, but they also have learned to punish deviation to high prices, so that nobody of these algorithms, once they have learned, will ever decide to change the price, because then changing price will be seen as a deviation from the collusive agreement, which would then reduce the profit of the algorithms. Now, I have to to be clear here, there has been a lot of discussion on this possibility, which and the research that I was mentioning that I contributed to is somehow pointing that this possibility is a realistic possibility, but we have to be clear that from here to say that this is already something that we observe in the market, we can't say this. So there is early empirical evidence from other authors that shows that maybe in some markets we may already see some of these signs, but at the moment we don't really know. So the question, what I think it's interesting is then asking, given this possibility that is now becoming realistic, what do we do in terms of competition policy? Do we act or do we wait to see potentially negative effects in the market? So my take after some years of reflection on my side on this is, no, it's too early to act. It's too early to act because, and this is related to what I wanted to say, what I said before, because AI is a novel tool and we still have to see its positive outcomes deploying entirely in markets, and acting now on the basis of what we know currently would be too early and would really risk chilling the development of these very important tools. By the way, going back to my previous example of general purpose technology like electricity or like ICT more recently, it normally takes from 30 to 50 years to see the outcome of these new technologies really changing and impacting deeply in the market. So acting now on the basis of what we know, to me, is too early. This doesn't mean, that we just have to wait and see the price of products increasing in platforms because possibly of autonomous pricing algorithms. What I think we can do in the meanwhile is actually endow competition authorities and authorities which are not necessarily competition authorities in general to understand better the functioning of AI algorithms. And there are some approaches on this. One interesting approach is sandboxing. The idea of sandboxing is, in a nutshell, before an AI system is deployed in actual market, we have to test it in virtual environments, in simulated environments. And this is something, as I mentioned with my previous example, it's something that we can do. It's a matter of proper design of the simulated environment, and then we can prepare ourselves in terms of authorities to these possible outcomes. And if I will have time, I will come back later on the recommendation system, which is a very interesting area, but for the moment, I'll stop here.
Thank you very much, Giacomo. And before giving the floor to Pierre, just reminding our audience they can send questions via the system, and we'll try to select a few and ask our panelists. Pierre, please.
Okay, so mindful of the time and the fact that I'm sure Christina has something to say and audience should be able to ask questions, I'll be relatively brief. So here's a question: is the event of AI problematic in the sense that it makes abusive conduct more likely to go undetected and to be effective, right? And in that category, I think there are two broad kind of conducts we would look at. One is, collusion, explicit or not, let's say not explicit there. And then there's this kind of some form of foreclosure using those algorithms to disadvantage rival in a way that does not correspond to competition on the merits. Now, how should we deal with that? As Giacomo says, on the one hand, it's early days. We do not know exactly how those things work. But personally, I think it's already time to set down a few general principles. And if you look at the corporations, implicit corporations / collusion / coordination, I like the kind of logic that underpins our horizontal guidelines. And one of this logic is that if you look at the vertical chain from R&D to setting the details of the pricing, is that we worry much less about possibility for coordination upstream than if we get closer and closer to the downstream. So in that sense, I think there should be a rule that yes, we worry a little bit less about some algorithms kind of dealing with some complex logistic issues or operational production issues than with algorithms that look maybe even at advertising or pricing itself. So there's going to be an increased scrutiny and suspicion the closer the use of obscure algorithm comes to the lower end of the market. There's also another fact is that, algorithms are best used for things that are very complex, especially very complex for humans. What's complex for a human is not necessarily what's complex for an algorithm. And from that point of view, again, there are very, very tough production coordination, logistic, inventory question. Quite frankly, except in a very, very few environments, I'm not sure how much pricing actually needs the brain power of an AI machine to be effective. It's been done quite effectively for tens and tens of years without it seems to be, kind of disaster on either side of what's offered to the consumer or the profit of the firm. So this is another reason why I would be a little bit suspicious. So what would I say? And I would say, yes, well, you've got to be much more careful as you go closer to pricing or things like that. What does it mean, being more careful? It means that you have to be more transparent. As we already argued, depending on the kind of algorithms that you have, whether it's designed for first principle by thinking people like you and me, in which case it's fairly easy to reverse engineer the logic, from the kind of a deep neural learning, where if the network is deep enough, good luck even for people who wrote the learning algorithm to figure out what's going on. I would say, well, sure, fine. So suppose you use one of those kind of very, very obscure algorithms to set your pricing policy, and we observe, prices have been rising or something like that. Your burden of proof, your duty is to tell me what's happening. Tell me your story. Just saying, oh, it's just the algorithm. That's what the algorithm does. That's not enough. When you come close to dimension of competitions that are very important, either you don't think you're going to be able to explain to me, but then don't use this kind of algorithms, use other algorithms. Or if you use these algorithms, you do not explain, but we observe anti-competitive outcome, I'm sorry, you're responsible. Okay. And that from that point of view, is the rated point. If you look at algorithm, what also matters is how they train. They train with respect to what kind of objective. If you train a face recognition algorithm to say, okay, do you recognize a face or not? I have no problem with that. Okay. On the other hand, why? Because the objective of recognizing the face or so on is completely dependent from anything having to do with competition, consumer surplus, with competition itself. On the other hand, if you train an algorithm like a price algorithm to maximize profits, profit is not a neutral measure. It's not a neutral measure saying you recognize me or not. It's a measure that can go up because of good things and can go up precisely because of attain to competition. So I would also use the kind of measures that you use in order to train your algorithm, or to tell the algorithm whether it's doing well or not, as a possible part of assessing without your algorithmic conduct is anti-competitive or not. I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Pierre. So just a short follow-up, if you don't mind. Do you see a situation in which firm unilaterally chose an algorithm with a certain algorithm to do a certain thing, pricing, for example, without any kind of coordination with its rivals?
Yep.
Will be found, let's say, I will take it to the extreme, guilty in price fixing? If
we observe that the adoption of this algorithm has been associated with a large increase in price and margins, I would say, what has changed in your pricing? You cannot explain it to me in a verifiable manner, which is not anti-competitive. Yes, I think there should be a presumption.
Christina, I can see that you have a response.
Actually, I don't want to talk about algorithmic collusion. I'm glad that both Giacomo and Pierre touched upon it. I agree that this is something which has been, of course, capturing the attention of economists, and quite a bit has been written on it, but still at the level of what are the mechanisms that may make this kind of work. And I think we are not there in terms of policy yet, in terms of how we deal with it. What I want to talk about, in fact, is types of conduct which are already here, in which which is not really something where collusion we are super focused on. I'm talking about situations in which machine learning and algorithm are used today to do things that range from excessive data collection, which is then exploited by deep learning, machine learning, to target, to discriminate, to extract rents, especially at a time where, this is a particular concern of mine, data protection rules are systematically violated, not particularly well enforced, and so the whole picture is super weak. And this is less of a traditional foreclosure story, much less so. And as Pierre knows, we've discussed it many times. There is a potential aspect of it that may go towards disadvantaging rivals, and I can talk about it. But the main thread here is really that these type of algorithm can and do power up conduct that can harm consumers directly through unfairness, through manipulation, through exploitation. And personally, I think this is something that we need to focus on a lot, and not just kind of kick it into the long grass of the DMA, but actually take it on board as antitrust enforcers. The most obvious field for this, to my mind, is targeting of consumers. This is what takes place. And targeting can take various forms. There's price targeting and other types of targeting. But fundamentally, while as economists we say, well, you know, what's so bad about that? You do better matching, right? You match types and characteristics, you make them a price offer that is better for them. We also know that this is true when there is competition of some sort. But when you have firms with gigantic market power, which are discriminating, well, it isn't quite so good in terms of the outcome, because they are in a position to pretty much extract rent, target, and do things that we are not happy with. So particularly when you're talking about targeting, which is done in ways that is not terribly transparent, which is done in an opaque way, which uses information which is sensitive on health, on particular mental sort of conditions and so on. So that to me is a apparent, real, and present danger. It's happening today, and it is something that worries me. There are forms of personalized prices that can lead to concerns that are distributional concerns, even with competition, because you may end up targeting consumers that are more vulnerable, for example. And then you can have non-price personalization, right? Sort of giving personalized rankings, not just prices, to a particular individual based on a vast amount of information on its own, or her own search and preferences and so on. So this is something which is not necessarily all good. And it also has a competition dimension, of course, because to the extent that in some cases you can, for example, preempt someone from churning, going to a competitor, because you've identified circumstances in which they may be about to churn and you make them an offer that makes them stay, then you are preempting someone from acquiring a customer. So this area, to me, is incredibly important, and one in which we should certainly focus on. I think it is not just a question of foreclosure of competitors, but it's a question of direct harm through exploitation. And it is something that we don't do enough of. The final point that I will make is also that I think there is a broader question also about what does it all do? What does this do to the direction of innovation? Because of course, all we care about is what innovation is doing. And of course, AI is a great tool, is a great, broad, ambitious tool for the direction of innovation. But again, I am concerned that the way in which it is now often very much in the hands of the dominant digital companies also drives the choices which we see being made on innovation. This is why everything looks like an app. because everyone is creating apps everywhere in Silicon Valley, because that's the form of innovation that effectively is driven by this. And so we are not seeing the diversity and the variety that we would like to see. I'll stop here.
A short follow-up, if you don't mind. Would you think, Pierre, you mentioned it, but would you say that such a targeted pricing is something which is more suitable for a competition authority to deal with, or to maybe a new sector regulators like the DMA?
Well, that's why I said I don't think we should leave it to the DMA. I'm a little worried that, although I understand the limitations of enforcement, and Pierre can tell us chapter and verse about the restrictions that they kind of face dealing with, and it's always very easy for outsiders to sort of comment from the outside. It is also the case that, of course, the DMA is coming, but implementation is going to take time. How effective and how quick it is going to be, I think, is an open question. I have said for some significant time that we've been too focused on have a hammer looking for a nail. So foreclosure theories have been the bread and butter of what we've done in antitrust. I think exploitation is, in this area, a more fruitful way to go. And it is something that we ought to experiment with and try it out. It's not a crazy thing. I mean, it does reduce consumer surplus, which is, at the end, something we should care about.
Thank you. Turning to you, Giacomo, Pierre, would you think that using exploitation to tackle this kind of, for example, targeted pricing is the way to go?
I personally think that's certainly something to try. Let me put it in these terms. We have, to some extent so far, worked too much taking consumer protection and competition policy as they were completely separated worlds. And I think what AI, some of its applications, is really showing us is that to some extent this is no more possible. And exploitation is, it's, if you open up a economics handbook or manual, there is no word exploitation. So there is no word of excessive pricing. So these are difficult concepts to properly address. And we know that if you want to win a case, you have to properly address if you want to win the case on this basis, you have to have a proper definition and be convincing what you want to say. But I agree with Christina that this is something that I would say a brave new world that it's worth experimenting. I disagree with Christina with a view on targeting and in particular on personalization. So, and let me say a few words on what you mentioned at the beginning on recommendations. Now, recommendation, there has been a debate already on recommendation, on the possibility that large platforms that are vertically integrated, I don't want to make name, but you certainly understand what I'm referring to, were selling their own products as well, competitor products. They can steer consumer attention on their products. That's a problem. I agree. It's a specific problem on vertical integration, also related to some amassing of the data that we were saying before, exploitation of data from sellers and etc. and so on and so forth. But recommender systems, which are these AI tools that are exactly designed to make personalized recommendations. If you open up one of those or if you open one of those platforms, you will be shown your personalized recommended items. If I open that same platform, I will be shown different recommended items. And this is not random. This is because someone, actually the algorithms, has identified certain preferences about products that we may like and you may be interested. And these may be completely different what I would like instead to try. And think about the hundreds of millions of products which nowadays are available on platforms. We will never have the possibility to know about this product, to know about the match value between our preferences and those products. The recommender systems are tools that are designed precisely on this. Again, this is another example of an extremely successful already application of AI, which of course can be manipulated.
Right.
But you can't say that that's a problem of recommendation system. That's a problem how some companies may use AI.
Yeah, but that's the point, Giacomo. I mean, I'm not saying that every form of recommendation is bad and we should be all getting a million kind of things to look through. But in reality, it can be manipulated in ways that are not benevolent. That's all. And that needs to be looking into.
As almost any strategy in market, I would say.
I was just going to say that Giacomo gave us the topic for another panel of an additional hour. So we have to wrap up. Christina, Pierre, Giacomo, thank you very, very much for taking the time and being with us. And thank you and goodbye.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.